I spent like $1,500 on like 40 different brands, for like one bottle of each. Some brands basically had nothing in them.
It's the Wild West. Who knows what they're doing?
It just blew my mind because if you're a consumer, if you go to the grocery store and you look for regenerative products, expecting a specific nutrient density, I want to make sure that I get that. We are not doing super great in the US with actual testing and verification of claims, so I think that was something that was very surprising to me. Again, because the omega-3 fatty acids are just so much higher in grass-finished beef. What was really interesting too is that they conducted human control trials. They really showed that whole transfer from feed to animal to consumer, which I thought was very, very cool.
But what I thought was so cool is that regain of weight after
Yes.
a diet. So like the fact that those omega-3s potentially prevented rebound effect, I thought was really cool. You did a project. What did you find when you tested, and what do you think the most interesting preliminary findings are? Because I don't think this has been published yet, has it?
Not yet, no.
Okay. Hey everyone, if you've ever wondered if you should spend that extra money on grass-fed beef, or if there could actually be measurable and meaningful changes in your health if you ate grass-fed beef, or maybe if the beef that could actually be the best for the environment could also be the best for you, this is a podcast you should listen to. I have someone I've admired from afar from a long time, assistant professor of animal science, Dr. Krusinski. I read a lot of his papers while I was preparing for my dissertation, and his specialty really, as I see it, is kind of the intersection of agriculture, nutrient density, and how animal products can be improved in their nutrient density. And so I'm really excited to have you on the show, Lucas. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, like you were saying when we met before, there's not a lot of people in this who are really intensely studying how the nutrients change in animal products based on how the production system. So it's really nice to finally meet another familiar face. And before we get to your story and how you got here, I like to do the rapid fire, just so we can kind of get an overview of what's to come. So first, in a few sentences, which is very hard for scientists, I know, but is all beef created equal?
I don't think so. And I think we have evidence showing that based on a lot of different factors, diet being one of the most contributing one, we see big differences, but also in other management practices, breed, geography, like all these different factors. So no, I don't think all beef is created equal.
Nice. What do you think of the Vital Eggs controversy? Vital Farm eggs.
That was interesting. And I'm also not part of, I didn't run the analysis on the eggs or something, so I can't really comment on exactly what was done, but it does not surprise me, unfortunately. And it's also, it just shows that we need some changes in our food system with transparency and testing. That's how I see it.
And what do you believe are the most misleading labels on animal products today, if you could name a few?
That's hard. I would say pasture raised doesn't really mean much. Grass fed, if it just says grass fed on meat products, for example, doesn't really mean much either. So I think that's the main two. Yeah.
What is the most surprising thing you've learned in your research?
What was really surprising, especially talking about nutrient density and labeling, like you were just mentioning, is that we are not doing super great in the US with actual testing and verification of claims. So I think that was something that was very surprising to me.
Yeah, and that's one of the big reasons we're here for this conversation today, because I read a paper that you actually got published this morning, which is really, really cool, about that really simple concept that hadn't been articulated in that way for me, that we are measuring practices, like how much grass is a cow eating, but consumers are motivated and excited about nutrients. And so we need to become more in alignment with that. That's beautiful. And last one, if consumers, and this is a very hard one, I'm sure, but if consumers could only use one nutrient or marker to kind of judge the quality of beef, what would you pick and why?
I would pick omega-3 fatty acids, just like the whole class. Mostly just because, not only in the US, but in most of the Western world, we're pretty efficient. We're not consuming enough of omega-3 fatty acids. And there's so many health benefits associated with them as well. So I would pick omega-3 fatty acids for sure.
I love it. We are so in alignment there. That was the part that really excited me was that, wow, beef can actually measurably, meaningfully impact levels in the blood. And some people just don't like fish. So that's really cool. Okay, so Dr. Krusinski, tell us your story. So how did you went from like a tennis player, I think you're from France, and then you moved into this world of animal agriculture and you write about it so intelligently that I was convinced you were a rancher yourself. But tell us how you actually got here, aside from my assumptions that are inaccurate, actually.
Well, I mean, first, thank you for your kind words. I appreciate that, you're reading the papers because that's most of the time it goes into papers and not a lot of people read them. So I'm really happy that you do that.
I loved them. Yeah.
But thank you. And yeah, as you said, I grew up in France. I did all of my schooling up to high school there, and I grew up in, I would say, a small town. It's not a big city by any means, but I did not grow up a farmer or like in a family of farmers or ranchers or anything like that. But I think I was still connected to where my food was coming from, just because I could see all the fields, around where I lived, and we were always, really conscious where we're getting our food from. So I was in France up to finished high school there, and I played tennis basically my whole life. And after high school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I knew that I wanted to keep playing tennis. That was the main thing that I was interested in. So I looked into my options, and I think coming to the US was the best option at the time for me to just keep playing and studying at the same time. That was great, just because in France and other countries, if you want to do sports and study at the same time, it can get tricky. So it's hard to balance in the US, like the whole infrastructure makes it easier. So after high school, I graduated and got an offer to play Division I tennis at Morgan State. So it's a small school in Baltimore, Maryland. So I was there for 4 years, but when I got there, my major was actually undecided. So I went with no major because I had no idea what I wanted to do. But I was really into sports, fitness. I was really looking into what I was putting into my body, like food. I liked cooking, and then I wanted to go to med school. And human nutrition was basically the major that helped you fulfill most of the requirements, like all the prereq to go into med school after. And I liked nutrition and fitness and sports, so I thought it was a good fit for me. So I went into human nutrition with the first goal of going to med school. And as I was taking the classes, you start really basic, and I took a lot of medical nutrition therapy, like all these different classes more geared towards working in hospitals or as a dietitian. And these classes were not the one I liked the most. What I liked the most was like all the food science, food chemistry, biochemistry classes. And that's how I learned about the field of food science. I didn't even know that was a whole thing until towards the end of my undergrad. So I moved into that direction, and in undergrad I started doing a little bit of research as well with one of my professors. And that was mostly just looking at carotenoid intake in college students. So really small study, but it was published, and as an undergrad that's great to have the first paper out. And then I really wanted to stay into the field of food science, and I really wanted to do research. So I looked into my options and I applied to a lot of different grad schools in different states. And then I found Dr. Jennifer Fenton at Michigan State, who was doing a lot of good work and really interesting topics. So I just reached out, and it happened that she just had a project that was funded, so that was perfect timing. And that project was actually working on grass-fed, grass-finished beef. So how I got into that field was really not by accident, but there was a little bit of luck in it, where I got to Michigan State, there was already a project funded, and I just went with it. So didn't really know much at the beginning of my PhD, didn't know much about grass-fed, grass-finished beef. I was eating meat, but I was not super knowledgeable about meat science in general. And as I was starting to work on this project, I discovered so many things, and this project started mostly because just before I got there, they did a nutritional survey of grass-fed, grass-finished beef samples from across the US. And I think they had 650 or 700 different samples coming from producers all like from around the country. And they did a nutrient density analysis looking at fatty acids, minerals, micronutrients, vitamins. And they found big variations between producers, and all samples were supposed to be grass finished. And that's how my PhD project started, was looking into what could cause these variations. So we looked, yeah.
Yeah, can I say, so that is the Bronchema paper, correct? In
Yes.
2019? Yeah, and I talk
Yes.
about that a lot. And our editor will pop that on the screen from my memory. And then I want you to tell us like what you thought was so interesting and then go into your dissertation on that. But
Yeah.
12 different, I think, producers across the America, and their omega 6 to 3 ratio within the grass-fed category, I think it went from 1.8 to 26 point, to
Yes.
20, yeah, 1.8 to 1 to all the way up to 26 to 1, meaning
Yes.
it was not a homogeneous or, similar outcome within one category. So I just want to put that
Yes.
on people's radar. It was a huge variation. So now tell us, like, what did you expand upon in that research?
Yeah, so like you were just saying, especially the omega-6, omega-3 ratio, like you said, some of them, I think the highest was 28 to 1, something like that. Where usually grain finished, feedlot finished is around 10, maybe 15 to 1, but that's like really like, the highest value you see. So doing my PhD, we're trying to find reasons of variation. So what could cause these big variations? So we looked into different breeds. We thought there would maybe be a breed effect. We looked into pasture diversity. We looked into supplementation. So we looked at all of these different factors that we knew could cause some variations. And we can talk more about specific projects later if you want, but we basically were not able to replicate what they found in that survey. So whatever we did, we were never able to get above 2 or 3 to 1 in the omega-6 omega-3 ratio.
Interesting. In all the grass-fed beef.
Even in some of the feedlot beef we had, it stayed below 3 to 1. We included soybean hulls, we stayed below 2 to 1. So it's still a work in progress. I don't think we found the reason why we saw these big variations. But
Was there any one category, like you said, that stood out that seemed to be more meaningful in terms of breed, feed, region, supplements, like anything?
Well, we found that the diet had the biggest impact. The breed effect was there, but it was not as strong as the diet effect. So that's why we then transitioned into looking only into dietary management and practices, because we thought that this would cause the biggest variations. So the breed effect was there to some extent, but the diet was just so much stronger that we focused on the diet later on.
Okay, yeah, let's dive into that for a second. And just so people know, and I'll ask you to expand on this too. For my dissertation, we did the Beef Nutrient Density Project. Dan Kittredge is developing like a handheld meter. So people are going to be able to scan beef and look at first the omega-6 to 3 ratio, then hopefully other metrics that we can also talk about. But why would you say the omega-6 to 3 ratio is the most meaningful thing? Or you said omega-3 fatty acids as a whole, but
Yeah.
why do you think this is so important, omega-3s, but then also the omega-6 to 3 ratio?
So what I found, and at the beginning I was really into the omega-6 omega-3 ratio. I think that, that's one of the strongest indicator that we have. But when we looked at the exact fatty acid composition in our beef samples, we found that actually the difference in omega-6 fatty acids is not as big as we thought between grass finished and grain finished. The main difference is the large variation in omega-3s. So because grass finish has so much more omega-3 fatty acids, that switches or balances the whole ratio back. But it's not really the omega-6 fatty acids that have the biggest impact. It's mostly the omega-3 fatty acids. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. And now we also use like other metrics like the omega-3 index, for example. So there's other metrics that come that maybe don't even look at omega-6 fatty acids as much. And I'm just talking about beef, like maybe it's different in different foods, but yeah, the the omega-3 fatty acids as the whole class, and then the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio are big indicators. And again, because the omega-3 fatty acids are just so much higher in grass-finished beef, that comes mostly from their diet. So if they're out on fresh pastures, fresh grass has a lot of omega-3 fatty acids that are just transferred into the meat. So this is one of the strongest indicators that we have that animals were actually out on pasture and consuming forage. So maybe not only on fresh pasture, but because if you feed them conserved forages, to some extent you can also bring some omega-3 fatty acids back. There's also other supplementation strategies that are there that can also increase the omega-3 fatty acids. But from all the studies that we did, every time we looked at what were the most contributing factors to differentiate grass-fed to grain-fed was the omega-6 omega-3 ratio and omega-3 fatty acids in general.
Yeah. And for people, like we said, like 75% of the world is deficient in omega-3 fatty acids. They're important for our heart, our brain, our eyes, our immune system, the resolution of immune system. Animal products are really important sources because they have those longer chain formed EPA, DPA, and DHA. So let's talk about what are the levers? Like you said, feed. Okay, so when we're looking at grass, types of grass. I just want people to understand, like the research you do is so granular. You really look at, so many different variables within the grass, okay? And then we have supplements. So can you give us an overview, like of the levers that producers can pull in order to improve the omega-3 content of their beef? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's actually a few things that you can do to actually increase omega-3 fatty acids. I think the first one is probably increasing diversity in the pasture, so having more different plant species. And we had, that was one of the earliest papers I did during my PhD, was just looking at the pasture. So we're trying to look at what happens in a pasture over time and what are the impacts of different species on the nutrients. And we found that some really specific species of plants would contribute specific nutrients. And then when we moved to other projects where maybe the pasture diversity was not as great, maybe the difference in the transfer of omega-3 fatty acids to the meat was not as great as well. So I guess the first thing is really just checking first what is out in your pasture and trying to increase the diversity if possible.
Yeah, so is it legumes, like cowpea? Are there certain plants, fescue, like what are the ones? I'm trying to think of what are the plants that I noted, because we did that in our project too. We looked at the particular plants that seemed to be around all of the samples that had the high omega-3s. Do you remember any of them?
So I remember, so from the top of my head, I think in that specific project we had alfalfa was one of them. We had Bermuda grass. We had legumes as well. I don't remember exactly what species was contributing what nutrients.
Yeah. I'll look it up too because I think clover. I remember
there was clover in there.
Clover
Yes.
definitely
Yes.
was one of them. Okay.
Yes.
And then what about the other paper that I read recently? And that's what we found in our dissertation too, or my dissertation is the longer the grazing period at the end of their life, the higher the ALA, the plant-based form, which makes sense. The grass is just being incorporated, and then the lower the omega-6 to 3 ratio. But like you said, not all ranchers and farmers have access to fresh green grass all year long. So you also looked at hay and silage. And so can you tell us, like, if we're going to get into the conserved forages, like what have you found are maybe the best ones to go with?
Yeah, and it's exactly right. It's really unrealistic to have ranchers or producers have the animals on fresh grass all year long just because of geography, weather, and like a lot of different reasons. So we looked into some of the most common conserved forages. We looked at hay, we looked at baleage, which is just a fermented conserved forage. We looked at soybean hulls, and now we just finished a trial with distillers grain as well. But if we're just talking about omega-3 fatty acids and what could be added if we don't have access to fresh pasture, we found that hay is still the gold standard. When we had animals out on pasture supplemented with hay, they just, their nutrient density was just better. But we found some interesting things too with baleage. So baleage is a fermented conserved forage, and when we looked at secondary metabolites and organic acids and phenols and all these different compounds, we found that animals that were supplemented with baleage actually accumulated a little bit more of some organic acids, which are byproducts from the whole fermentation process. So having some fermented conserved forages also helps with concentrating some other secondary metabolites in the meat.
And if you had to hypothesize, what kind of human health impacts might that have, even though you might not be able to demonstrate that yet?
So one thing we didn't do was we reported a lot of compounds in our meat, but we didn't quantify all of them. So a lot of the organic acids that we measured, a lot of them were just relative concentration compared to other groups. Organic acid as a general class have a lot of different health benefits. I mean, they're used a lot in foods just for shelf life. Sometimes to just make food last longer, but they also have some anti-inflammatory, they have some anti-cancer. They're just basically antioxidants that we can, basically accumulate in the meat as well.
Amazing. And then when it comes to this, I'm very excited about this supplementation thing too, because like you said, not every farmer and rancher can have perfect conditions, right? All year long, things happen. But what about linseed? What about grapeseed extract? What about distiller's grain? Can you what are the good supplements, and then what might be the more detrimental practices too?
Yeah, I think let's start with the good ones.
Yeah, let's start with the good ones. Yeah.
So linseed or flaxseed, I think it's the same, depending where you are, it's the same grain. I personally haven't tried anything with linseed yet, but I have friends and colleagues in France that work for an organization called Bromfield, and their whole thing is using linseed. So even their logo has like a linseed flower, So and they really did a lot of trials with that plant, especially feeding it to animals and then seeing how that's translated to the meat and then to consumers. So they included linseed in their rations. Like you said, when you cannot have access to fresh grass, I mean, you can always supplement. And even if you do have access to fresh grass, if you want to increase a little bit your omega-3s, you can try some of this supplementation as well. And linseed always increased omega-3 fatty acids in meat, and also they also tested in eggs and other products, and milk, cheese. So using linseed as a supplement, we know increases omega-3 fatty acids in animal foods. What was really interesting too is that they conducted human control trials. So they had a trial where they fed people, so one group was fed meat coming from animals that were supplemented with linseed, and another group that was just fed regular meat. And they found that people that consumed the meat that were supplemented with linseed actually had more omega-3 fatty acids in their blood. So they really showed that whole transfer from feed to animal to consumer, which I thought was very, very cool. And that's been around for a long, almost 20 years now. It's been a while. So that's, with linseed we see clear advantages. So that's one supplement that can help with increasing omega-3s.
Yeah, and I just want to say on that trial too, I think this is the Legrand trial from 2009. Yeah, and
Yes.
what I thought was really interesting was this was all animal products, by the way. We're talking a lot about beef, but this was pork and the chicken. And after the trial, I think it was day 90 to 270. I can't remember. But the group that didn't have the linseed actually gained more weight. They gained more weight.
Yes.
They had a higher BMI and a higher waist circumference. The other thing
Yes.
about this trial is that they changed, I think it was probably a lower calorie diet than most people were eating before. So, which kind of confounds things, right? Because you're not looking at just that variable, you're also looking at potentially the introduction of a healthier diet overall. But what I thought was so cool is that regain of weight after
Yes.
a diet, 95% of weight, so the fact that those omega-3s potentially prevented that rebound effect. I thought was really cool. What did you think?
Yeah, no, it was super interesting, and I like that they follow up, even after, and see what happens with long-term health effects. So I thought it was very, very interesting that, like you said, the group that was fed animal products that were supplemented with linseed just didn't put the weight back compared to the other group. That was crazy. Yeah.
It's crazy. And I've talked to like Dr. Anthony Holbert. Have you read the book Omega Balance?
No, but I've heard about it.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
highly recommend it. And he just suggests it's again, these omega 3s have a lot of like adipose prevention and kind of just like weight management benefits. And so I like that trial because I thought it spoke to that. So anyway, keep going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's linseed is, I mean, it works for omega-3s. We also tested grapeseed extract just because that was, I mean, that's a really inexpensive byproduct from the wine industry. So it's just waste. So it's not it's really cost effective. And our whole point or like goal with using that was we wanted to include it in a total mixed ration as a positive control of transfer of phenolic compounds from feed to meat. So we just wanted to see like how much of that is actually transferred. Unfortunately, we didn't find much with that supplement just because I think the dose we used was a little bit too low to actually find, significant differences. So I can't comment on how much it helped, but I know that you can use, a lot of byproducts and waste from just agricultural products. And I'm all for it, if we can have a circular economy and like just reusing waste and byproducts, I mean, I'm all for it.
Absolutely. Have you looked at algae at all? I know some farmers, have you looked at that? What is,
I haven't.
you haven't?
I haven't, but we thought about it. I think one of the challenge with algae is still somewhat hard to grow and cultivate, so it's not super easy to get. But there's like papers on it that show that omega-3 fatty acids are also increased in meat, and it can also help with methane emissions apparently. So that's great as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But like you said, it's not as sustainable necessarily as it stands right now. Maybe, we just have to
Yeah.
find some solutions there. And then, okay, so I want to talk about those secondary compounds in a second, but I kind of want to close this loop on, are there any other supplements that you've used that you didn't?
I mean, this data's grain, I guess.
Yeah, that's what I was
So
gonna
we
say.
talked,
Yeah.
yeah, we talked about the one that have some good impact. The reason why, so we just finished, and that's in collaboration with Michigan State still. They just conducted a feeding trial there, and the goal was to again look at supplementation and see if we could still replicate like these big omega-6 omega-3 ratios that they found in that nutritional survey. And one idea was to test distillers grain. So distillers grain it's just a byproduct from ethanol production. So it's also like a byproduct that's super inexpensive, super cheap, and super easy to get, especially in the US. And some producers are already using distillers grain. But the reason why we wanted to test it is because it has a high omega-6 fatty acid content. And we thought that maybe including that in the diet would actually move the needle on the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. So I can't comment on the results. I don't have the results yet, but we just finished the feeding trial, so we have the meat samples that they'll analyze soon, and we'll see what we get. Yeah.
Fascinating. And I don't know if you know Kenneth Hamilton from Biominerals Technologies. Okay, so he does a thing called Omega Balance Beef, I think. And so what he does is kind of educates around every grain has a different omega-6 to 3 profile, right? So corn is going to be the highest, right? And then soy and wheat actually surprised me. They were a lot lower.
Yeah.
Corn and soy in these total mixed rations are a big part of them. So if you had to guess what they were doing in the Bromfield paper for the 28-to-1 ratio, you had to hypothesize. What were those ranchers or farmers doing, and like what are the grains or feeds that you think are making that ratio really, really out of sync with most?
So, yeah, that's a loaded question. I think
Yeah. You don't know. You don't know.
I can't say for sure what they did. Like I don't know, but if I had to hypothesize, I mean, first we really thought that including soybean or distillers grain, like these type of feed or supplement, would actually move the needle. So that's what we really thought at the beginning. And just because producers were coming from all over, I mean, again, if they don't have access to fresh pasture, I mean, it's they have to feed their animals. So that's what we thought. Another big thing to mention about this study is that they just received samples from different producers, but it was not controlled trials. So they didn't go to like each of the farms and see exactly what they did, collected the samples themselves, so that's something to keep in mind as well. And what they reported was basically just production practices that the producers themselves were voluntary, like giving to the research team. What I think, especially if you have like now 28 to 1, 26 to 1, I just don't see how you can get to these values. One thing that's possible is that maybe some of the samples were just not grass fed or grass finished.
Yeah.
That I think that's the easiest explanation, because if they just shipped a grain finished, sample that was kept in confinement, fed a high concentrate diet, I don't know what would be in there, but that would be the simplest explanation to me, is that it was just not grass fed or grass finished.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense to me. And even in our trial, we found, I think grain fed was around an 8 to 1 usually.
Yeah.
So that's, it's still like really crazy. But then for our trial for grass fed category, it went from 0.6, so below 1 to 1, all the way up to 11. So again, still a lot of variation, but still not that type of variation. So do you think that they will ever, do you want a day where they put, like they can in the UK, beef is a good source of omega-3 fatty acids? Because anything over there, over 40 milligrams per, I think, 100 grams, is able to be labeled that way. Do you think that that would be helpful in America, or that that's coming?
Yeah. I think you're referring to is it the EU standard?
Yes.
Like the 40 milligrams? I think that would be helpful for consumers. First of all, if you just look at the nutrition panel on a piece of beef, right now we would just talk about fat, total fat, saturated fat. It's really basic. So if you can't even see that, like what concentration of omega-3 fatty acids are in these products, it's just not listed there, unless the producer or the company decides to put a QR code that you can scan, and like on their website they list their independent testing. That's some do that. But if you're a consumer going to the grocery store and you're just picking based on the like front label and like the back of the pack, it's really no way of knowing how much omega-3s you're getting. So I think including something like this, including just a little bit more information on the nutrition panel, would be very beneficial to consumers. And if you have a clear cutoff, like we just talked about the EU standard that is set at 40 milligrams, and I think they sum up EPA and DHA, so 40 milligrams per 100 gram of food. That's a clear cutoff. So then you can compare whatever is listed on the nutrition panel to that value. So like, okay, if I consume that food, I'm getting a good source of omega-3 fatty acids. And they do it with some things, like I just bought sardines not too long ago, and like they list exactly how much EPA, DHA is in there. So it's possible. And I think the consumers now are getting way more savvy, right? Like with health claims, and they just want to buy food that's good for them and the environment. And they look for these things. Like now they're really conscious, especially about omega-3s, right? Like that's one of the big ones. I think most consumers would actually at least heard about them, and a lot of them will actually know that they have some health benefits as well, and that they should consume more of it. So I think including that on the package would benefit the consumer, but also the producer, if they can market it as something that's very nutrient dense that can help consumer reach their health goals.
Yes, and I want to move on to phytonutrients, but last question. So I've heard this argument that because the amount is small in beef, that it won't meaningfully impact human health. So do you want to comment on some of the trials that have been done that show that it can? We kind of talked about them before, but how much of a difference is this making? And what do you think people could expect in their health, or what have the trials shown?
I think the first thing is, of course, even the best grass-finished beef will never compare to salmon, right? So that's the first thing. But like we also said earlier, is not everyone has access or the funds to buy fresh seafood all year long. That's the reality. So when we looked at and we quantified omega-3 fatty acids in beef from different diets and different locations, some beef, especially if it was out on a diverse pasture supplemented just with hay, for example, it accumulated a lot of omega-3 fatty acids, which came actually very close to that 40 milligrams per 100 gram mark. It was not quite there, but it was close. So if in the EU they consider a food that has 40 milligrams of omega-3 fatty acids per 100 grams of food a source of omega-3 fatty acids, I would say that grass-finished beef, again, if it's really grass finished on biodiverse pastures, and like if it's done very, very well, can contribute good amounts of omega-3 fatty acids. I think that's the first thing. And then there's actually a good amount of studies out there that fed these products to consumers, and we're interested in looking at how that's translated into people. And they found that when people are eating grass-fed, grass-finished beef, or beef that's supplemented with linseed, for example, there's more omega-3 fatty acids found in the blood of these people. So we know that there's a clear transfer. So it's possible. It obviously would not contribute as much as seafood, but if you just need to diversify and include a little bit more omega-3 fatty acids, I mean, that's one way to do it.
Yeah. And I think I remember my dissertation that we eat about 4 pounds per person of salmon every year and 59 pounds per person of beef.
Yeah,
So yeah,
yeah.
it's just like it's also a way to get that. I'm also wondering about phytonutrients. Because you're using metabolomics. I just have to say, like, you're using very advanced technologies that are giving us a recent advancement. It's giving us an indoor or kind of like a broader picture of the changes. 30,000 in our project, compounds in beef. So do you think that these plant compounds, or are there other big changes that you're seeing with metabolomics that you want to talk about?
Yeah. So yeah, we did Metabolomics, and that was when we started. Was in collaboration with Stefan van Vliet, so he helped a lot with getting all of this started. So we included that towards the end of my PhD. So in the first studies, we didn't include all of that, but then towards the end, we started including more and more compounds and like these phytochemicals. So for listeners that maybe don't know, like phytochemicals are just plant-derived compounds. So it's compounds that we find in plants that that's what we hypothesize, if animals consume them, they will be reflected in their meat. So for this, we use mass spec technology. So it's fairly expensive, it's time consuming. So it's a lot more people are doing it now, but it's still not super accessible, especially if you're a producer that want to get their product tested. But what we were really interested in at the beginning were phenolic compounds. And that started with the grapeseed extract project. So this is why we used grapeseed extract as a positive control, because grapes and grapeseed extract have polyphenols. And we were really interested to see if we could reflect these polyphenols from the grapeseed extract into the meat if animals consume them. So that's what we started using. Metabolomics was mostly just looking at polyphenols. So we did this work and we found some interesting things. So we started with not as many compounds as we report now. But in that very first study, we found, and we quantified some of these phytochemicals, that grass-finished beef would accumulate more of certain phytochemicals compared to grain-finished. And these phytochemicals, if I remember correctly, one of them was stachygerin. So stachygerin is a phytochemical that you find in green tea, for example. So that was higher in grass-finished compared to grain-finished. Hippuric acid is one that comes up all the time just because it's a very good indicator of polyphenolic intake. So it's not a polyphenol directly, but it's a good proxy for polyphenol intake. So that was also elevated in grass-finished beef compared to grain-finished. And then when we moved towards other compounds, because initially we're looking at polyphenols, with metabolomics you can also look into animal metabolism and animal health. So by using the same technique, we were just reporting more compounds that were maybe more related to animal health and just metabolism. So we found that in grass-finished beef, so animals that were out on pasture, rotationally grazing, so just out grazing, some metabolites that are related especially to the TCO, the Krebs cycle, were elevated. Just because, we hypothesized just because they moved they moved more, right? They were out on pasture and just basically exercising more. And it's similar to what you see in athletes, right? In people compared to like people that don't exercise as much. So yeah, these were the main differences we found really early on. And again, that was all in collaboration with Stefan van Vliet, so I want to give him credit as well. And then we started including more and more compounds, and again, as we improved the methods, we had more standards and better way of quantifying all these different compounds. We also found that some phytochemicals were higher in grain finished just because these phytochemicals are usually found in corn, for example. So picoumaric acid is one of them. This is a phytochemical that's really abundant in grain and corn. So it made perfect sense that it was greater in grain finish. So when we talk about phytochemicals, just grouping everything in one big class is not super helpful because some phytochemicals, I mean, again, corn and wheat and all of these are also plants, so they also have, some metabolites. But if we just think about phytochemicals as, and I think most people would think of phytochemicals as antioxidants, anti-inflammatory compounds. If we think about these ones, we have evidence that these specific ones are accumulated in grass finished compared to grain finished.
Yeah, I think that's so cool. And I'm never one to suggest we don't eat fruits and vegetables and that we just get it from grass-fed meat. But what I'm really excited about is like there are many people in the carnivore community who have a level of gut dysfunction, who animal products seem to be a better suit or a better diet for them right now. And can we increase their diversity in their microbiome or their exposure to these plant-based compounds in a way that works for their body? I don't know. I just think that's really exciting. Do you see a day where maybe there's like a phytochemical richness score on grass-fed beef or on beef in general? Or do you think this is an area of research that will continue to evolve?
I think that's a current area of research. So people are actively working on this, talking about nutrient density score, like indexes, like all of these different things. So there's people doing work on that. I would say with phytochemicals too is there's always that matrix effect, right? So we look at individual compounds, we can quantify how much, but these compounds may act differently depending on what matrix they're in. So can we completely eliminate fruits and veggies for our phytochemical intake? I'm not sure about that. Just because there's a lot of different things that come with it, right? Like it's a different matrix. But can grass finished beef like that was raised on biodiverse pastures accumulate a lot of phytochemicals? Can you contribute at least a little bit to phytochemical or polyphenolic intake? I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah. I think that's interesting too. And then I read this recent trial and we were talking about it from Megan Pearl's team up at, I think, Montana State. And they were showing even the amino acid profile was a little bit different, grass-fed, grain finished, and that the grain finished seemed to be stimulator of leucine, which led to a higher insulin response. And I don't think, I just thought that was interesting. Do you have, before we go to Blue Blanc Core and practical stuff, do you have any other markers or research that you're interested in, or things that need to be developed or questions you need to answer? Anything like that?
I think one of the main questions that we still have to answer, and that's what you were just mentioning, is really that last link of how is it translated into people. So if people eat it, what happens to health outcomes? I think that's one of the missing links. There's some trials and studies that are being done on this, but most of them are fairly short, right? It's mostly postprandial, so it's not like very long term. But with the few studies that are out there, I mean, like you were just mentioning that specific study, they found a higher insulin response and higher leucine in grain finished compared to grass finished. I think they also reported in another study, I think it was the same authors if I remember correctly, a specific terpene or terpene-like compound that was also accumulated in people that ate grass finished compared to grain finished. So terpene is also a type of phytochemical, right, that has potential health benefits as well. But in terms of, so with omega-3 fatty acids and fatty acids in general, I think we have more evidence and information on how it's translating to people. But if we look at phytochemicals, even vitamins, carotenoids, like all of these, different compounds, we don't have as much evidence of how it's translated to consumers yet. So I think that's a really big topic right now. Is just working on that last missing link. And another thing that excites me, I mean, it's like you said, including more information on packaging, right? Because it's not only carbs, fat, and proteins. I mean, there's so much more to it. And there's so many more compounds that we don't even know exist yet. So that's the most exciting thing. We still talk about the dark matter of food, right?
Yeah.
So
tell people what you mean by that. I don't know that what do you mean by that?
So, so with mass spec and the metabolomics techniques that we use, what limits us is, I mean, first the technology. The technology is always improving, right? When you get better equipment. but we can maybe report, hundreds or thousands of compounds in food that are already characterized. But we know that there are thousands and thousands of compounds that are there, but we just haven't discovered them yet, or we haven't characterized them yet. So that's what we call the dark matter of food. It's just like we know that there's more, we just don't know what it is yet. So as we get better with equipment and improving the methods and all of these things, hopefully we can start discovering more and more compounds that we didn't even know existed.
Yeah, it's really exciting. And Dr. Van Vliet's team has been doing some of those human trials, and preliminary data suggests a trend towards, less inflammation with all the diet coming from a regenerative source and versus conventional. But he does admit that the bigger change is like just going to a whole foods diet is a far greater improvement.
Yes.
But that there might be another additional improvement. But yeah, I'm really excited to see where those trials go, and if your lab jumps on the bandwagon, and maybe do you have any intention of doing some of those trials eventually?
I would love to. It's just, and the reason why we don't have that many trials out yet, it's very expensive. It's difficult to, monitor exactly what people are eating. So there's a lot of challenges coming with that. And like you said, a lot of the trials use already either overweight people or like people that have some health, issues. And when you put both of them on the whole food diet, like he was saying, you'll see big improvements in both groups. And a lot of the trials are also just postprandial, so it's very short term. We don't really know what will happen if for months or years you consume a specific diet like that's high in regenerative produce or meat. So I would love to. I just don't know if that's something I can do anytime soon.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm super passionate about this. I would love to do it. It's not in the next few projects.
Okay, fair enough. Now, but one of your big projects that we alluded to in the beginning, it just came out today, and it was, like I said, so beautifully articulated. So tell us what this paper is about. I will give you, let me see if I can find the title. You just sent it to me. Okay. And it was Exploration of Food and Food Omics and Regenerative Agriculture and Nutrient Density, the U.S. Certification and Regulatory Landscape from Obligations of Means to Obligations of Results. So I read this paper and I was like, I have to reach out to Lucas finally, because he's speaking my language, and I think he gets to the heart of the disconnect right now between, okay, what producers are doing and what consumers are caring most about. So tell us about this paper and why you felt you needed to write it.
Yeah, that paper honestly started because I attended, like in the last few months, two conferences that included a lot of producers and consumers all interested in regenerative ag. And I love going to these events because I just talk to so many people from different parts of the food system, and they all have different points of view, different opinions, and different issues that they want to address. And that specific event, there was a lot of certification and labeling organizations that were there. And there was a lot of talk about, so first regenerative ag and ecological outcomes, which is great. And I would say most of the talk was really about regenerative ag and nutrient density. And my big interest is in nutrient density. So, and I agree. If we can increase nutrient density in our food and we can benefit producers and people, I'm all for it. But one thing is, if you go to the grocery store and you look for regenerative products, most of the time it comes with a premium as well. Same thing with grass-finished beef, right? It's a little bit more expensive, which if I know that I'm supporting a producer and it's better for me as well and for the animal and all of these things, I'm willing to pay that. But if I pay more for certain products, expecting a specific nutrient density, I want to make sure that I get that. So after that event, it just got me thinking of, let me look at what the labeling and certification landscape is currently in the US. And that was regenerative mostly, and grass-fed, grass-finished. So that's the few labels that I just look at 6 or 7 of them. So it's not the whole thing, but it's the most common one, I think. And I went on each of their websites, and I just wanted to see their standards. So what's good about all of them, they all had publicly available standards. You didn't have to email them, you just go on their website, you can find them pretty easily. So that was great. And they all have clear guidelines for production practices that need to be used. So that's what I mean by obligation of means, right? Or just checking what the production practices are. And they have really clear guidelines for this, which is great. But one way to check for this is on-farm visits or documentation, right? Like that's the two things that you can do. But then when you go on the website, or even what they were just talking about at that conference, is nutrient density. So I was really interested to see if I could find what their standards were for measuring nutrient density. So I looked at the standards and I couldn't find anything. So I was really digging into all of the standards, and there's no testing of nutrient density of any sort. But if you go on their website and on their social media pages, or just talking with them at these conferences, they all claim that, look for my seal, this will give you better nutrient density. And I thought that was I was surprised, but not too much, but I was still surprised, just because nutrient density was such a big part of their like marketing and their speech, right? So I looked at their standards, couldn't find anything. And that it just blew my mind, because if you're a consumer and you already pay a little bit more for, I don't know, like a piece of beef with a specific label on it, thinking that you're getting that nutrient density, I would want to have that confidence that I'm actually getting that nutrient density.
Absolutely.
Because when I report nutrient density in grass-finished beef, that comes mostly from highly controlled feeding trials. So I know exactly what went in, what went out. We saw with that Bromfield paper, right, the nutritional survey, if we just get grass-fed, grass-finished samples from around the country without actually knowing exactly what went in and what went out, sometimes you get surprises, right? Like you get a piece of meat with a 28:1 and 6:3 ratio.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how this whole paper started, and it's not a very long, elaborate paper. It's like a perspective. So I'm just looking at what's out there and basically commenting and giving recommendations. That's what it is. And I'm also not calling out like these labeling agencies or like producers at all. Like that's not the intent of the paper. I think the intent of the paper is just looking at what is currently being done. What do we claim? What do we test? And how do we move forward? I think that was the point of this. And then I took, like you were mentioning earlier, the example of the Bleu Blanc example in France, which I think is the perfect hybrid framework for this type of things. So they have obligation of means, meaning they look at production practices, they go on farm, they look at what they do, they collect documentation. But they also have very clear guidelines for nutrient density. And that includes the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, phytochemical content, things on vitamins. So they have like really clear guidelines, and it's also publicly available on their website. And it works great there. So they have, when you look for their label on any product, because they have a lot of different foods, they have sardines, they have eggs, they have milk, they have cheese, they have meat, they have a lot of different things. It works, and they have a system that works. And I really want to use that example of what is possible and what we could do moving forward in the US.
Yeah.
So I think that was the main goal of that specific paper.
It was wonderful, and I didn't even realize that existed. And then they have a cutoff, I think like a 4:1 or 5:1 of omega-6 to 3 ratio, meaning that America's beef would just not really make that cutoff. So
Yeah.
I just want to say that, yeah, I hope that becomes what we adopt here. And before we get to like my two last questions, which is how do you choose your meat, what labels, and like what would you tell producers? I'm wondering about pork, chicken, dairy, organ meats. I know you're testing some things on organ meats. Do you have anything to say about the other meat products that you think is important for people to understand?
Yeah, I mean, I can comment, and I'm just gonna say I didn't do studies on chicken and pork and all of this, so it's just based on what I read and what others do. But we did do some projects with eggs, and I know my Dr. Jennifer Fenton at Michigan State, my PhD advisor, is actively working on eggs now. With eggs, we see clear differences in nutrient density when chickens are out on pasture and just doing their natural behavior, just foraging like insects, plants, like anything they find basically. So we found more accumulation of omega-3 fatty acids we found more accumulation of fat-soluble vitamins, and that's in the egg yolk. So if you just eat the white, you will miss out on all of these things.
Okay.
But they're also currently doing a study with eggs and looking at phytochemicals. So they want to see like that transfer in egg yolk and see like what that would look like. So in eggs, there's evidence, and Bleu Blancaire, again, they do a lot of work with eggs as well. They clearly show that if we have chickens out on pasture, foraging, just, you know, having normal chicken behavior, they produce eggs that are more nutrient dense than, you know, chickens that are free range, whatever that means, right? Or that are kept in a barn, basically conventional eggs. With chicken, it's a little bit trickier with chicken and pork just because they're monogastrics. So with beef, we have, it's tricky in another way just because you have a lot of intermediate and isomers that are produced by the rumen, which is great. So we have some fatty acids that we only find in ruminant products. With monogastrics, it's tricky because we don't have that whole biohydrogenation going on in the rumen, but what they eat is more directly reflected in their meat because they don't have the whole system in between. So if you find a way to eat a supplement or give them a diet that's species appropriate, that contains compounds of interest like omega-3 fatty acids or polyphenols or vitamin, whatever it is, there's a good chance that this will be more directly reflected in their meat compared to if you did it in, you know, ruminants.
Yeah.
So that's one of the good things with pork and chicken. The issue, and I see that in the US, is, so first, the US, the meat we consume the most is chicken. So that's a big trend that was reversed. Like back in the days, it was more beef, more pork, now it's more chicken. And we produce a lot of chicken. So it's also like an issue with the whole system where we have to produce a lot, right, to like meet that demand. So there's definitely big issues, and that's the same thing with eggs, with chicken and eggs. We have issues in the US that need to be addressed, that's for sure. And we know that when chicken just, you know, perform the natural behavior and are out foraging, they produce eggs with more nutrient density, and their meat will also be more nutrient dense. So if even in flavor, you can feel it, right? So if you buy like a chicken that was, I don't know, regenerative, foraging on pasture or whatever, if you eat it, it doesn't taste like a conventional chicken you get from a regular grocery store. And I think taste is a good indicator of nutrient density. So if it tastes good, it's most likely good for you, right? So it's like, and pork, I can't comment too much on it, but I think it's one of the good things, like whatever you put in, you get out. So you don't have like that whole thing happening in the middle, which is great. But you can't also not feed them, you can't just keep them on pasture, right? Like they're not cattle or sheep. So there's also challenges with what, you know, you need to put in their ration and like how to feed them, but
Yeah, and with chicken and pork, I know that the omega-6 to 3 ratio can be like 20 to 1, even eggs, up to 30 to 1, I've heard in some pork. And I know a pastured pork farmer who did his own experiment, and he took a specific breed, put him just on grass, you know, and got it down to like a 5 to 1. That's really abnormal for pork, but chicken, I think the big opportunities are there. And how do we change the way we're feeding and raising those animals? But I will, to your point, say that we have a regenerative meat delivery service, and people, the flavor of the chicken is one of the first things people talk about, is how different that is. And last thing, organ meats. You did a project most recently. I didn't even know you were doing it when I talked to you.
Yes.
And our organ meat supplement didn't make it in there because it wasn't available yet, our Just Liver. But what did you find when you tested? And what do you think the most interesting preliminary findings are? Because I don't think this has been published yet, has it?
Not yet, no.
Okay. Give us a taste. Yeah.
Yes. Organ meats, I mean, I'll start with fresh organ meats. Fresh, like let's just say beef liver, is very nutrient dense. So it's very nutrient dense. If you look at, it's really old paper, I think from the 1980s or something. They looked at grass-fed beef liver, and the omega-3 content is way higher than in muscle, like way higher. Same with fat-soluble vitamins, really great, like in vitamin A, for example, really great in some proteins and amino acids, B vitamins. So in fresh liver, it's really a concentrate of nutrient density. Other thing with organs, especially the liver, is it's there for a reason, and it's there to filter, right? So it's you also have there's some risk of finding heavy metals if you're not really careful with where you source it from. If the animal was stressed or had some health issues and had inflammation, you'll find some biomarkers in the liver as well. So with fresh liver, I think what's really important is knowing where it comes from and where you source it from. But it's very nutrient dense, that's a fact. The study we did was not on fresh liver, so we looked at beef liver supplements, which is very big and popular right now because I love liver, I love the taste of liver, but I know a lot of people don't. So that's one of the big challenge, right, is people just don't like the taste, so like they just don't want to eat liver. So now there's a lot of companies, like maybe like you're doing, that put liver in pills, right? So it's like defatted, desiccated, and it doesn't taste like anything. So what we did is, initially we started this project because we're just interested in, can we find inflammation markers in these supplements? So I bought 40 different brands of beef liver supplements online. It was really easy to find, and I didn't even know you could find 40 different brands, but it's even more than that. And we looked at a specific acute phase protein called serum amyloid A. And that protein is usually elevated in organs, so liver is one of them, in animals that are stressed. So we find that in foie gras, for example, this is the force feeding animals, so they're very stressed, so they have a lot of that in their liver. Some evidence shows that grass finished or grazing animals have less of that protein compared to confined animals. So there's evidence that if an animal is stressed, like their inflammation will go up and that protein will be reflected in the liver. So that's the first thing we looked at. But then I had all of the supplements, and they're not cheap. I spent like $1,500 on like 40 different brands, for like one bottle of each. And I was like, well, people buy them, and if you look at the labels, some of them claim nutrient density, right? So they claim specific things, especially in minerals or micronutrients, especially iron. Vitamin A is another one that they may claim, B vitamins, these type of things. And I was like, well, I have all these supplements, might as well test for nutrient density as well. So we first look at vitamin A because vitamin A is very potent in liver. And in fresh liver, if you eat too much of it, you can actually there's something called vitamin A toxicity. So you can have too much of vitamin A, you have to be careful about that. So we looked at vitamin A and we looked at minerals. So minerals like iron, zinc, I think we had like 8 copper. And we also looked at heavy metals. So let's start with the bad ones. So serum amyloid A, we identified that protein in all 40 different supplements, but in very small amounts.
Okay.
So the amounts are very low. There's also big variation between the brands. And these amounts were so low that I don't think it will reflect in any health issues for consumers.
That's good.
That's good. Because I think in the study in mice, they had to feed them like 10 milligrams orally to see like amyloidosis in mice.
Okay.
And we're reporting in microgram per milligram, like very, very low. And you also you consume it, so you'll probably denature the protein anyway as you digest it. So that was good. We didn't find much of that. We then looked at heavy metals. All of them were very, very low, below range.
Great.
So that was great.
That's great.
That was great.
That's great.
Then vitamin A, I was mostly concerned about elevated levels. But so first we found very, very big variation between the different brands. That's the first observation. Second, we recorded very low concentrations of vitamin A. And I thought it was so weird that I repeated the analysis twice because I was really concerned, I was just confused why it was so low. But these supplements were all defatted. And vitamin A is a fat-soluble vitamin.
That's interesting because we don't defat ours, but all 40 of the other supplements were defatted.
Yes.
So that's really interesting. Okay.
So vitamin A was very low, like way lower than fresh liver, and like way below what we thought. So vitamin A toxicity was not a concern for sure.
I guess that's good and bad.
Yeah. So if you consume it because you want to get vitamin A, maybe it's not great, but at least you're not going to get health issues. So that's great. But what we found was big variations between the 40 brands. And when we looked at minerals, the variation were even bigger. So some brands basically had nothing in them, like just nothing. Others were really close to fresh liver, so like the variation and the gap between the good ones and the bad ones was huge. And then we performed like I call it a nutrient density score, but it was just basically normalizing everything and ranking them from more nutrient dense to least. And more than half of them were below average. With a few brands, like I would say like 4 or 5 out of the 40, basically having nothing in them, like just nothing.
Which, unfortunately, I want to say a lot of supplements are made by marketers and they're not,
Yes.
who don't care. So there probably is nothing in them, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's, like you say, it's not the the FDA doesn't really regulate much of any of this. And so it's really unfortunate because if you take these supplements as, I would just take iron, right? Like that's another big deficiency we have in the US. You're an individual that has iron deficiency and you want to consume these products because you think you'll, increase your iron intake. You just won't get it and you don't even know.
Yeah. And what are you getting? Like, what are you, what's in there?
Exactly.
That's another.
So what I'm thinking, especially for these lower ranked one, is either the processing they use, like just removed a lot of the nutrients. That's one possibility. I don't really know how the process did. It's not, on the label or anything, so it's really hard to tell. Another option, and again, I don't want to throw any, and I'm not naming any brands or anything, but some of them look like they might have something else than liver in them. Maybe a filler, like rice flour is a big one, like that we use in, that in supplements, or just other cuts of meat, maybe, like, or other species. I'm not really sure, so I can't comment on this just because we didn't take the study that far, and that might be a secondary analysis where we look at exactly what was in them. But I think it's either based on processing or just adulteration. So having stuff in there that should not be there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, sounds to me like, defatted, lowering levels of fat soluble nutrients. And then we freeze dryers, but like you said, it's the Wild West. Who knows what they're doing? And then what they're potentially adding or what proportion is, maybe there's a little liver and then there's like 75% rice flour, and who needs more rice flour? Okay, well, I hope that you do end up doing that secondary analysis so we can figure out what's in these organ meat supplements. But last questions is 2 questions. So you know so much about nutrient density, and we don't yet have Blue Blanc Core here. So what are the labels that you're looking for in beef and other species? And then if you were a producer and you had your own cattle and you wanted to raise the most nutrient dense beef, what would your operation look like if money wasn't a factor? Nothing was a factor.
Okay. So first part of the question, I think to know exactly what you're getting, the best way is to go directly to the producer. I think that's, talk to your farmer, talk to your rancher. I think that's the best way to do it. Just see what, and if you just look at ranchers around you, like most of the time, especially if they do things right, the ranchers will be very happy to talk about what they're doing and show you the animals and show their operation, right? Especially if they have nothing to hide and they're doing everything the right way, they will be more than happy to show you. So that's the first thing, and then you're supporting your local rancher or producer, which is great as well. So I would prioritize this. And I would say it's not something I'm super great at, so I'm just giving recommendations with maybe not stuff that I'm doing myself. And as most listeners or most producers would do, is go to the grocery store. I think what the US, and talking again about labeling, what the US did good and like a good program is like certified organic. That's one that is regulated. There's actually federal regulations for it, and it's actually tested. So I think and I also put it in that paper, is like another example of what we're already doing in the US that works. And people actually look for that label, right? So it's like, it's something that already works. So that's one label that works. And another disclaimer too is like, we also have to think about accessibility and, maybe not everyone have access to these type of foods, or like have the means to buy like these type of foods. So I don't want to say like only buy this. Even with grass finish and grain finish, I'm not saying grain finish is bad. Like that's not what I'm saying at all. Like if you can only find grain finished or for grain finished, go for it. I mean, it's still very nutrient dense. Like that's that's another thing I wanted to say. But at the grocery store, one label that combines organic and regenerative is the regenerative organic certification.
Yeah.
And I think that's the one that's the most widespread. That's the one I see the most at the store. And I think Whole Foods has a lot of them. When I buy beef specifically, I look for grass finished labels, but not only that, because I know that just the label itself would not tell me everything I need to know. There's other ways that you can assess, especially if it's beef, like the color. Grass finished beef has a very, very dark, almost like game meat, like very dark color, and the fat will be more yellow. And that's another thing that doesn't require any testing. You won't still know exactly what the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is, but if I see a very dark meat with yellow fat, I know it was at least 99% of the time on pasture.
Nice.
So that's one thing I look for when I buy meat. So it's not only the label. I honestly don't look at the label too much. It's mostly just the color.
I like that. What about chicken? And you don't do as much work with chicken and pork. Do you think the color of the egg yolk is that? I know that they can add things now, but is it something that you trust too?
Yeah, like there's a way that you can actually cheat with that too,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's a good indicator. And when we did these studies in eggs, like all the ones that were out on pasture and foraging, they had more concentrated yolks and they were like orange or really dark yellows. That's another good indicator, but it's really hard to know that information when you buy like the eggs in the store. You have to open them, so you would have to try and error, I guess. But with eggs, I honestly don't know of any in the US of any label that would give me really high confidence in what I'm getting. So I mean, if the best thing is to buy it from the producer, that's what I would recommend. But I know it's not possible, and I'm not doing that. I don't eat too many eggs, but it's very hard. I'd still try to look for some indicators, like if you open the box and like they're all different colors, or like they don't all look super uniform. Because if you get the cheapest eggs, like they all look the same, right?
They do.
But if you buy, yeah, so if you just open up the box and just at least look visually and try to assess, I think that's what I would do. And with milk, I mean, like there's some good producers. Alexander Farm is doing a very good job with dairy, and they post like their nutrient testing on their website. So that's a great way. I think they're in most grocery stores. So with dairy, I think they're doing a little bit of a better job compared to meat with advertising the nutrient density and like all these things. And what I would say for all listeners and consumers is read the package. You know, a lot of people actually don't look at everything. And some products now like actually include like a QR code or a little bit more information about the farm, about the production practices or the nutrient density. So it takes a little bit more time. You have to actually stop and look, compare different products. But that's the easiest thing you can do. And again, you can't trust all the labels and all of these things, but that's a good place to start. I think that's what I would recommend. And for producers, and again, I'm commenting mostly just on beef because that's where most of my work was done. But I would prioritize, and again, depending on where you are in the US, that would depend. But if you can, keeping them out on pasture as long as you can, and increasing the biodiversity of your pasture, I think that's a big one. Because if you just compare monoculture to biodiverse pastures, there's already a big difference. They're both grazing, they're both grass finished, but then nutrient density is already different. So increasing biodiversity in your pastures, rotational grazing, that's a big one, right? Especially if you do not have too much land, or high stocking density and just moving every day or every other day, so they have access to fresh grass, and you give time to your soil and your pasture to just regenerate and grow back. That's what I would recommend, and that's the first thing I would say. Depending on where you are in the US, if you have like long winters, right, and you cannot have the animals on pasture. In terms of supplementation, I mean, conserved forages, I would use hay and baleage, or like fermented conserved forages work great just because they contribute different things. And in terms of supplementation, if you're mostly interested in omega-3 fatty acids, I mean, flaxseed or linseed is a really good one that is proven to work. There's a lot of studies on it. If you have access to algae, you can always try that, but I don't know how easy it is to find, and I don't really know the cost. But also, if you want to increase the diversity, even if it's not on pasture, it's also including byproduct of waste from other agricultural commodities. You can include orange peels, olive pomace, like wine byproducts and waste, all of these things are free or cheap, right? Because it's just waste. You increase your diversity and you give basically access to more biodiverse nutrients and compounds to your animals to choose from.
I love it.
So that's another recommendations.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Krusinski. This has been awesome. I loved it. I loved every minute of it, and so helpful for consumers, producers, no matter who you are. So tell people where they can connect with you and learn more about your work. And if you have any other statements or things you think people should know to make this conversation more complete, then let us know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. That's a really easy one. I have a website too. If you just look up my name on the website, I have all my contact information. So email, you can email me if you have any questions. I'm pretty responsive with that. And something else I would add, let me think. That's more geared, I guess, to producers maybe and like companies, but thinking of nutrient density and trying to include testing if you can. I know it's not feasible for everyone, but consumers want transparency and they're willing to pay a little bit more if it shows better nutrient density and is better for the health. They're willing to pay a little bit more. And there's great companies. I mean, Audacious is one company right now that does nutrient density testing. And you can just ship a few samples, right? Just see like what you're doing. And they have a really good benchmarking system. So you can compare your product to others and see how you're scoring against USDA standards and stuff like that. So if you can, and again, I'm not saying everyone should, but try to communicate better about your nutrient density on your website, your social, like all of these things. I think it will benefit you and the consumers as well.
I love that idea. And, it opens companies up to liability, but you can just say, this isn't every batch can't be the same because of seasonality. I mean, even like the leaf to stem ratio and what time of year, what cycle of growth these plants, I mean, like it's so nuanced, but I do think it's the future. We're using Dr. Van Vliet's lab and I'm using your research as kind of like a guide. And so thank you for all you're doing. This has been amazing. And I will be watching your research closely forever. And we'll link to all your papers below as well. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much for your invitation. I appreciate it.